authentication. I want to talk specifically about end-to-end authentication. You probably heard in Greg's keynote this morning, there's a new product offering. You hopefully have met some of the people from LaunchKey that are here. I want to talk about how we're going to tie those together. How do we actually make those work together and do something broader and bigger that encompasses this entire end-to-end authentication experience. Before I do that, I want to throw out a definition really quick, just so we're kind of level set a little bit. Authentication is the real-time corroboration of a claimed identity with a either defined or specified or agreed upon level of confidence, right? So it's very straightforward. However, when we start getting into authentication beyond that point, it gets very complicated, right beyond what it is that we're trying to do. I just want to know, yes, this is Michael to some level of confidence. It gets very complex in terms of how we actually accomplish that. It's the oldest piece of information security. If you've been in information security for very long, typically some of the most complex pieces of it. There's knowledge-based authentication that we've talked about today, and device-based authentication, and multi-factor authentication, and two-factor authentication, and it's going to do nothing but get more complex in that regard. What I really want to talk about, though, is what do our customers experience from authentication? Particularly, what do your customers experience? What do they see? What is their perspective of authentication? As it becomes more important, it gets more layered. We're not really doing them a whole lot of favors. Their experience of authentication is very much like TSA at the airport that almost everybody had to go through to get here. It's literally the worst part of the entire journey. Nobody really knows what to do. There's various stages of discomfort, or in some cases even undress in different parts of what you're doing with the authentication experience. So no matter what you're doing or your level of authentication or how you authenticate, you have to kind of funnel everybody through the same process effectively. And it helps to sit back and look at what our long-term vision is and look at what Greg outlined and what we'll talk a little bit more about this morning, what Scott will go into in terms of our roadmap tomorrow, and look at authentication and say kind of why is it this way? If you've traveled anywhere, actually, but if you've been to a train station in Europe, it's not like airport security at all. Almost nobody is nervous, harried, or otherwise distressed in this picture. This is in Belgium, but even if you go to the United States, this is one of my favorite train stations in Washington, D.C., Union Station. There's nobody in any stage of undress in this picture that I can actually tell, right? And there's a lot of security and logistic and socioeconomic reasons for why authentication is different, or verification is different at a airport or through TSA than at a train station. But let's start thinking about how we would get from state A to state B. What would we need to actually get there? And in doing this, we're going to talk about the pieces, what we've acquired in terms of a full product through LaunchKey. We're going to talk a little bit about what our vision is, and what do these look like when we tie them together and create this end-to-end experience. I think Tiffany did a great job describing that, but I want to talk in specific terms about what you need to do, what we need to do as organizations, as an industry, and then talk about some tools to actually make that happen. So four things we're going to have to do is understand the risks better. When I say understand the risks better, a lot of it has to do with depth of field, how much we can actually see, what is the focal point of a risk. Is this a risk or is this a risk? It's the same thing in two different perspectives. We could ask the same question if we're doing rules based on, is a VPN present in this transaction? Well, is it risky? Well, it kind of depends. Some people are actually using a VPN to communicate, get on their network when they're not actually in their office. So we need to understand that risk in much greater detail and be able to act on it in real time. Second piece of this, so we understand the risk better, right? We need to understand the context better. Context is a really interesting word. We're going to use it a lot over the next couple of days. And very often when we're speaking up here or speaking anywhere in meetings, we'll use the word context in a lot of different ways. So I want to try to narrow it down for you a little bit and talk about context in terms of your field of vision, not your depth of vision like it's in when I talk about risk and understanding that better, but the field of vision. My dad lives in Indiana, and I love visiting in Indiana. I love going to see him. It rains all summer. Is anybody from Indiana before I insult anybody here? Okay, so it rains all summer. It creates great sunsets. It's great afternoons. However, it's a really dangerous place to live because when you're looking at a sunset, in the same field of view, in the same vision is like an F3 tornado, just randomly, just out of nowhere, basically. This is what we mean by context, is getting as broad a view as you possibly can of what's happening. If I dial into my financial account, to my banking, one of my banking accounts, and I authenticate myself, and it says, yes, I know that that's Michael, Do you let me in, or do you stop and go, you're Michael, and why are you in Kazakhstan? Like, that's some of the context that we bring to it. And that's just one simple example. But there's so many different pieces that make up what we call context. How can we make that part of the end-to-end authentication experience? So the third thing that we need to do is we need to understand that these things change. Risk and context change on a daily basis. They'll change on a session basis. If we're ever going to get to this notion of continuous authentication, we need to capture changes to risk and context on a per session basis, not just when we're actually trying to initiate or start up a session. So when I say understand, be willing to adapt to change, this is a key thing for information security teams, for user experience teams, for our security teams, or fraud teams, is what is your willingness to adapt, your willingness to change? If I live in a world where I can go wherever I want to by jumping to ice flow, and at the risk of bringing you down, you know, if there's a world now that exists where I think literally this summer they, call it radio tagged a polar bear that swam for 9 days straight, basically. So without any regard in terms of, the reasons for that or the cause, there has to be a willingness or a desire to adapt, to change the way that we're authenticating people, and also to change sort of midstream in the midst of that actual process. So we have understand the risk better, understand the context better, have a willingness to be able to adapt in flight as we see sessions that come in or new users that come in. I think the fourth thing, and then I'll start showing models of what this might look like in reality, is use tools that help you respond to change. Since things are going to change and we have a willingness to adapt, what tools do we have at our disposal to help us actually adapt? It's a very cliched phrase, but frankly, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a what, right? So if all you really have and understand is username and password, if all you really understand is KBA, which I'm not knocking necessarily even any of those, they're part of a layered authentication experience, everything will tend to look the same. I need to authenticate, I'm going to use this method. This is how I'm going to do it. So we need to start opening up that toolkit to look at lots of different areas. So what do we get? We get 4 things that I'd love to get our thoughts around and build a model of what that looks like. So we understand the risks better, we understand the context better, we have a desire to adapt either holistically or within a specific session. And then the fourth thing is we have the tools that enable us to adapt. Okay? This is the way that as of this morning with Greg's announcement, and there's going to be a new piece of information on here, this is the way that we view the world. And bear with me for 30 seconds because I need to talk about the product pieces that actually fit together before I talk about how we start solving these end-to-end problems, okay? So almost all of what we do is built that you know so well. As I said, I'm the newest guy, probably one of the newest guys in the room, basically. You understand the core components that we're built on. You understand device recognition and how it works and those associations, what it means to contribute evidence and what it means to use that evidence. And on top of that foundation, we've built really our key products, which has been our fraud prevention capabilities for a long time and our customer authentication. What you'll see tomorrow, I think in Scott Olson's presentation, is we'll start expanding on the fraud prevention side with iovation Score, which is a predictive analytics tool that will help us better understand what we can do in terms of not just preventing fraud up front, but getting a better concept of what good looks like. And then, as we've talked about, we have our customer authentication. Now, LaunchKey joins us. LaunchKey MFA product joins us in a suite effectively now. So we now have a Dynamic Authentication Suite. And of course, we have our Intelligence Center where you interact with all of the tools that are available through iovation. But this is the piece that I really want to talk about. I want to talk about what it means to have a Dynamic Authentication Suite. What does dynamic mean to you and to your customers? How do you use that dynamic nature, and how do we plug those things together? This is what's going to get us to an end-to-end layered authentication. What I mean by that is from the first time that you see that customer, from the beginning of their experience to the end of their experience, be able to implement different kinds of authentication throughout that user journey, throughout that customer journey, throughout what they're seeing. And I'm going to use primarily 2 models. I'm going to talk about our customer authentication, which obviously is transparent, fully device-based, that we use to provide context, to provide an understanding of risk and provide a lot of the context that feeds this end-to-end solution. And then I'm going to talk about what LaunchKey looks like. And LaunchKey, if we haven't made it clear already, we're actually going to do a demonstration tomorrow afternoon with Scott Waddell and Scott Olson to talk about some of the details. And I'll talk about some of the pieces of that puzzle that it fulfills today, but it's fundamentally an interactive authenticator. It's a mobile authenticator that you can take and download on your phone, on your application. If you're one of our subscribers, you can build it into your own application if you have one. If you're already using multi-factor, it might give you multiple means to use multi-factor, and then as Greg said, have one point of interaction for everything, for all of the touch points that you have in your customer environment. So we'll go over what that means in more detail later. I really want to talk now about how these pieces actually work together. And I want to use a couple of models, basically, a couple of scenarios. And in the first one, I'm just going to say you have a customer. So I'll use a retail scenario. If you're not in retail, bear with me, because I'll get to something that you're probably more aligned with soon. But I have a customer, and I know who she is. I know that she wants to buy something. She wants to buy something immediately. She literally saw a sign on the back of a bus bench or a subway, and she wants to buy something right now. I really want to let her buy that, right? I really want her to get her immediate access and get in as rapidly as possible. I want to provide a very low friction environment because it's a low risk transaction. I want to do it as seamlessly as possible. So we're going to use device-based authentication, our customer authentication service. We're basically going to say, okay, you've been to this store in the past, right? We saw you in this store back on March 24th, actually. You're coming back again, and you have roughly the same geolocation, roughly the same IP address. There's no significant mismatch between that IP address and the geolocation. Or we could even be running a velocity check that says, have you tried to create new accounts with that device recently? We then look at it and say, are you participating or partaking in any anti-evasion or evasion capabilities? Are you using a VPN? Are you coming through a Tor browser? Ultimately, we look at what we know really well, which is those device associations. Are you, since the last time I saw you, has evidence of fraud or suspicion of fraud been placed against that device or device account by some other subscriber within our environment? And ultimately, we get to it and we say the device isn't jailbroken, it hasn't been rooted. Go ahead and let that person in and let them buy it. Let them do what they want to do and get their stuff. It's relatively low risk because when people buy things from us, it's not in itself an inherently risky activity, right? We let them check that device off, we come in, and she comes back to our environment and she buys something. So everybody's happy. That's the device-based authentication view of the world. But as we work up this pyramid, things change. Again, the level of risk changes. The level of our information and knowledge about that environment, what's required to authenticate that user, that request actually changes as well. So now we start talking about what would happen if we used the insight of risk, if we use the insight of threats that are visible around that device, if we use that to trigger multi-factor authentication using something like LaunchKey or any MFA device, what would that actually look like? So I'm going to use a banking site now. This may not be super easy to see, but it's really hard to find pictures online of somebody's banking site. Go figure. So this is actually mine, one of our accounts. When I get here, how do I get to this site? How do I actually land here? Well, today, I actually go and I enter username and password, and then I have to answer a KBA question that my wife set up 20 years ago that I'm a horrible husband, yes, but I still don't remember the name of her first pet. So we've had to reset passwords multiple times because I don't know KBA answers. But let's just say that in this future that I'm talking about, which is available today, how did I get here? I recognized Michael's device. I recognized it with a solid device print based on what I'd seen before in the past. And I did one thing, maybe on my mobile application, my on-point mobile application, or just through a separate authenticator if I want to. I entered in a 4-digit PIN. Now I'm here. I'm actually here at this point now looking at all the basic balance information, but I've made no specific requests, or really, this is not a particularly high-risk place for anybody to be, but we could imagine a world where we got here actually based on just the strength of the device, but we're not actually ready for that. But I can see that world coming. But now if Michael wants to do something else, if I want to set up a payment or set up a recurring payment, what do I do now? I've elevated the risk in that scenario. What can I invoke? What can I do? One of the things that LaunchKey lets us do is right then notify that customer. We've talked about the swipe capability. But I could come in right now and I could say, okay, you need to do one of two things additionally. Either trace your graphic pattern on the face of your phone. We're ready to receive that input whenever you are, the one that you set up in advance. Or make sure that some other device that you've prepared and authenticated is within proximity to that. You've got your Fitbit or you've got your Apple Watch or something right there to provide another factor of authentication. Even more, we could actually go to OnPoint, or OnPoint could look at what was the best possible customer experience. I could say, to do any of these things, you pick. Just pick two of these. You just decide whether you want to provide a PIN, whether you want to provide your biometric thumbprint just using the sensor that's on your phone, whether you want to use that Bluetooth proximity feature, or whether you want to use the circle code that we can enable. This is a completely different experience now. So my banking experience and my involvement in it is completely different. I've not sacrificed anything in terms of the value, the strength, the rigor of my authentication and the security in it. But as you can see, there's another level on the pyramid, right? There's another way to go up here, basically. And that top level of the pyramid, oops, I went backwards. Top level of the pyramid is a different picture entirely. So this is difficult to protect against, right? I have the right guy. I know that this is Michael based on all the authentication that I've seen before. Or there's some of those other indicators, the things I detected in terms of anomalies or risks that are inherent in that device print. Or the failure to authenticate one of those other ways puts me in a different situation right now. Highest possible risk, or I need to better understand that entire transaction. I need to actually get into the level of authorization. And that basically means, yes, I know that's Michael, but I want him to explicitly, not implicitly, explicitly approve that request that I'm making of him. There's lots of reasons for that. One is you're in line in that workflow, but there's also a traceability question that goes around that as well. So how do I do that? Let's look at sort of the same situation using the LaunchKey multi-factor capability. I've got another capability here now where I can actually say, for all these things, all these normal activities, yes, by all means, use some of the multi-factor capabilities. But if I want to do some of these things, if I want to create a new payee out of nowhere, or I want to send money to somebody I've never actually sent money to before, I need to do a swipe authorization. I need to actually send an active authorization to that person, to that Michael there. Or I might have to send it to both Michael and his wife, actually. And you can imagine by varying when that trigger occurs, how much security and assurance you can get out of this. You could say, if you're going to do a cash transaction to a new payee or a transfer of funds and it's under $1,000, use one of these methods. But if you're going to do it over $1,000 or over $5,000, whatever the limit is, you have to have Michael swipe authorize it, and you also have to have Mrs. Michael, you have to have his wife, Joey, also swipe authorize it. And if you step back and you look at a corporate environment where you have responsibilities for segregation of duty, this is one of the things that is really powerful. This is one of the patents around LaunchKey that really excite us in terms of what's available to people to provide 3 or 4 or 5 people the ability to authorize an action in real time from a mobile authenticator app. So to be clear, this is not Michael and his wife. The guy's dressed a lot better than me. And if you took a random picture of us at any given time, we'd more often look like this, actually. But this is what's really compelling about this entire end-to-end authentication vision, okay? We have this layered structure now that's built on recognizing the device, that uses the intelligence that we get through risk awareness around that device, threat awareness around that device, and we can build multi-factor authentication options on top of that, and we can get to a higher level authorization option above that if the risk is higher, or if the reward actually is higher if we were to foil that system. And we could do it completely in line with risk as it changes. So if we go back to my 4 points, we need to understand risk better. We need to understand context better. We need to understand when they change. We need to be able to adapt as they adapt and change. This is what we can do with LaunchKey as we start integrating these pieces together. We've done a couple of presentations in advance. We will talk about it again this afternoon and tomorrow. But in the few early conversations that we've had with some of our current subscribers and with analysts, there's palpable excitement around this, because we're doing something that frankly nobody else is doing in the market. And if you notice, none of what I just described was done using a password. Yes, passwords will coexist with all these levels of authentication, these different layers of authentication, probably for a very long time. But now they can start coexisting, and really they're independent of that. So one last thing that I want to draw a picture of and get you to start thinking about is, what does the experience look like? How does a user experience this, and what is their sense of what it looks like, what it feels like, what the interaction is actually like? So you may have seen this model before, but this is how we kind of like mock up a customer journey. This is a customer coming into a financial institution. So we've got financial touch points around this circle track, basically, but they could also be They could be retail touch points. One of these that's a high-risk touch point could be creating a new shipping address, which is inherently high risk as a vector for fraud. But let's talk in the context of financial. And if you're not in financial, let's talk later about how these touch points could actually fit into your model, what your customer workflow actually looks like. But how do we tie all of the pieces together? The first part of this journey is really all around a loaner account creation. So I want to show you where we would apply customer authentication capabilities, where we'd apply multi-factor capabilities, and the first stop is really looking at that loan origination or account creation piece, right? So at that point, we typically bring to bear all of what iovation does in our fraud prevention capabilities, all the rules and content, all the insight that we have to offer, but we could also leverage our multi-factor capabilities there as part of the identification step. We could send a multi-factor code, a PIN code, we could send any kind of response that we need if they've already downloaded an app, if that's what the workflow looks like. But once we get out of that point in time, that sort of singular experience of account creation, what does it look like on an ongoing basis? What is the recurring experience for that customer? When they go to do something like a login event, it gets a lot simpler and a lot easier than what my current experience is at OnPoint. Sorry to pick on OnPoint again, but it's a great bank otherwise. And this is typical of most places. Great experience, great people, great services, great capabilities, horrible authentication. And this is ultimately what we're trying to fix. So at this point, at login, all I have to have, again, is a device that I've authenticated that isn't violating any rules that we've set up or that we can detect, and I've got to have something. Let's say it's a PIN code. I'm just going to enter a 4-digit PIN. After all, that's what I use when I withdraw from a bank machine, whenever I withdraw from a bank machine. But if I go through the rest of that journey, as long as I've got that device, now we're talking about some notion of continuous authentication. As long as I've got that device, I've got that authenticated device that we recognize and have a high level of confidence in, let me, Michael, anybody go in and check their account balances because it's relatively low risk. But when they get to something else that's of a higher risk or where the likelihood of something being perpetrated is much higher, step up those factors easily, in line in that experience. Insert that combo, the circle code that we have available through LaunchKey, where you just set up what that pattern looks like as you dial that in, and that's what you reuse. We'll talk in more detail later about how that works, but it's all stored on one device. It's on the phone. Teresa was talking earlier about one of the horrible, horrible side effects of breaches today is having all those credentials available on the black market. Neither the PIN I've been talking about nor my thumbprint nor that circle code exist anywhere else except outside of this phone itself. So we've removed kind of one of those big problems, which is the stockpile and then resale of credentials on the black market. So I continue my customer journey. I do relatively low-risk transactions. I'm going to do a deposit, which I do all the time. I'm going to make payments, which I do all the time. I'm not going to really ask for anything other than, is that the right device? Is that Michael's device? Do we detect anything different right now that we should be aware of within the context of that device? And then I get to fund transfer. Fund transfer, obviously, inherently risky. And now I might say, okay, I need to have 3 factors available in there. I need to see 3 things. I need to know that that's your device and there's no anomalies associated with it. I need to know that nobody has contributed evidence of fraud to that device anywhere in our environment. I need to be able to see the circle code, and I'm going to send you an authorization code with the swipe authorization that appears on there. So now this is what we mean when we talk about an end-to-end layered authentication experience. I can utilize any of these tools anywhere, and again, we are not, we might have this question come up later this afternoon when both Greg and Jeff are up here. I don't feel like iovation as a group, are particularly on a mission to kill passwords and ruin that throughout the world and make them go away. However, we've just defined a path and an experience that customers could probably implement. You could implement it today largely without passwords. You have to fit what this is into people's current understanding of how passwords serve them as a security measure, how they authenticate, how they do validation. But if you look at this map, this circle, we now have a choice. We're not obligated to use probably the most painful method of second most painful method of authentication. You know the first is KBA. We have a lot of choice now. And the layered authentication end-to-end story, that's what it ultimately provides. It provides us choice in how we provide experiences to our users. And as we get more details about what the LaunchKey MFA capabilities are, we extend that choice not just to our customers, the administrators setting up security on their accounts, but to their customers as well, the end users. And say, hey, you've got 4 different ways that you can authenticate into these different activities for, like, again, in OnPoint, pick 2. Pick the 2 that you want to use. Or, pick 3 if it's a higher risk activity. this whole notion, and we've talked a little bit about password, what does this enable, on this road to passwordless authentication? And how do we actually get there? It's a pretty long journey. As I said, we're not going to unplug and dislodge this very entrenched technology tomorrow, nor is it really our desire. The real desire is we want to work with it. We want to make it work better through both device-based authentication as well as multi-factor authentication. Eventually get to a point where we start pushing the use of passwords. We start avoiding passwords wherever possible, like in the model that I walked through, where only if it's a high-risk activity do we actually ask the user to remember their password, and then also incur the cost of, if they don't remember that password, all of the call center costs that are related in that. And eventually we're going to get to a point in my working life, I'm absolutely sure, where between a strong device-based authentication and between multi-factor authentication, we don't have either of those anymore. I have a couple of key takeaways. So whether you are, we have a very diverse group. Whether your primary perspective is as a fraud prevention person, or whether it's as a security person, or somebody that really owns the customer experience, your brand manager, product owner, and you own the customer experience, 3 key takeaways for you. If you're the fraud person, if you're a fraud-centric, fraud-focused person, improving the authentication experience makes your life easier, as you know. How do you help improve it? Your experience and understanding of what makes risk and what combinations of risk and context create, actionable risk that you need to do something about now in the authentication process is key to this. I want you to insert yourself in the authentication process. Be part of it, because you have so much intelligence and insight to lend to what that end-to-end solution actually looks like. If you're on the security team, I really want you to think, this is a challenge. I've been working with InfoSec people for 12 years, and it's the same challenge everywhere. You really have to think beyond the enterprise. They think about authenticating their users in high risk. Teresa was absolutely right. You have to know your 1 or 2 most critical assets, but they sometimes just stop right there, and they really don't think about or care about extending authentication out into what I call the environment beyond the firewall. And what you're doing today does not work for those customers. We know that because customers hate usernames and passwords, and they especially hate the things that you can easily enforce internally, like, by the way, change your complex character with 4 alphanumerics and 4 special characters every 30 days. Customers obviously don't want to live with that. But think outside of that, out beyond into the world, and then also think in terms of user experience. User experience really does matter, which brings me to the last takeaway. If you're that person, if you own customer experience, if you own the product and it is your job to improve that product, really the pendulum really is in your court. Because 10 years ago when I was getting started in information security, you pretty much did what the CISO told you to do, even if you had customers out in the world. But now we understand the importance of user experience. And we've seen the impact of Amazon One Touch on user experience and how they didn't become a billion-dollar company because of One Touch, by the way. Through many, many, many different things, but that was a forefront focus for them all the time, is how do we deal with user experience. And then I would ask you, too, to set the standards. If you own user experience, set the standards for your organization. Look at Adobe Best of the Best benchmarks for how frequently your customers come back to the site, how often they're in the site, stickiness of the site, and then ask them to solve some of those problems for you. And that will lead you, by the way, right back to an end-to-end authentication experience, because that is the TSA of your entire application of the service that you offer. I'm very, very excited about this. I hope I can convey this well, and that through the sessions that we have today, this is a huge pairing. This is, some more sight gags. This is better than Batman and Robin. This is better than Ben and Jerry's or Tom and Jerry. This afternoon, if you do nothing, well, you'll do lots of stuff today, but please come back here at 4 o'clock today. We will be up here. The day that it actually happened, we will be up here. We're going to talk to Greg and we're going to talk to Jeff. And I will be able to answer more questions for you, too, about this journey. But please come back at 4 o'clock, and we'll ask them, where does this vision take us? What does it do for us? What does it do for you? What does it do for your customers?